Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Politicians are busy crisscrossing our country, trying to convince us that they have the best vision for Canada. After all, we are going to the polls on September 20th. The polls at the end of week one started to shift, something many of us wouldn't have necessarily predicted, since the shift doesn't favor the Liberals who called the election. And now, after week two, things seem to have plateaued somewhat. And I'm not surprised. Many Canadians are enjoying their last days of summer before returning to work and returning to school. Later in the program, we will have our election panel where we will discuss the latest issues from the campaign trails. And for that, we will be joined by Elliott Hughes, Senior Advisor from Summa Strategies and former advisor to Liberal Finance and Defence Ministers, and Yanni Macris, consultant with the Daisy Group and former Conservative parliamentary staffer. But now, to tell us what's happening in the polls, we welcome Quito Maggi, President and CEO of Main Street Research. Quito, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tanya.
So tell us, what's going on in the polls? Things have started to shift.
Yeah, kind of crazy start to this election. Some people don't like it, but after the one we had in 2019, there was just it was a tie. It started as a tie, kept going. It was just boring election. I'm having a lot more fun with this one. As you said, about 10 days ago, we started seeing a shift away from the Liberals to the Conservatives. It stayed pretty stable a couple days. Big shifts in Atlantic, big shifts in Alberta, big shifts in Ontario. A lot of noise, a lot of volatility. And then it kind of settled into this slow gain by the Conservatives. Peaked about 2 days ago where we had just under a 10-point lead, 9.4% lead for the Conservatives.
Across the board?
Across the board. Wow. Nationally, with substantial leads in British Columbia, very neck and neck in Atlantic region, lead in Ontario, and of course across the prairies and Alberta, a very substantial lead. And so overall, at that point, we had the Conservatives finally on that day take the seat count lead. And then it's settled in a little bit. It's sort of stagnant now, sitting at about 7.5 points, the lead. Okay. For the Conservatives over the Liberals. That's just happened over the last 2 days. This week now, as we start getting, as you mentioned, we start getting into September, people's minds kind of turn more to back to school, back to work. I expect more shifts to happen as these people come home from summer breaks and vacations.
Well, see, that's the way I see it. I see that parents will be packing their kids' lunches, and then they're going to be settling back into their work routine, and then people start Googling, okay, what are these politicians, what do they stand for? I'm just going to start reading my snail mail and reading the emails. But with respect to the I guess you could call it the Conservative surge, I was quite surprised. It was the Liberals who called the election, so obviously they would call it when things were more favorable for them. What do you think can be attributed to why the Conservatives are surging? Is it that simply people don't have their mind in the game, those persons who would more poll Liberal? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I wasn't as surprised as most people. If you recall, just before the election, Main Street did a poll and asked people, it was released just the day before, but we were polling on the weekend before the election was called. And we asked people if they wanted if they thought, the specific wording was, do you think right now is a good time for an election? And, 65% of Canadians told us, no, it wasn't not. And 35% said yes. But weirdly, the people who told us yes were largely in Alberta, in the prairies, young people under 35 who have been led by the NDP for most of the year. So it was the people who don't support the Prime Minister and the current government who were actually telling us they did want an election. So that pointed to something weird that might happen at the start. And then, we've been asking other questions since around the leadership that, we released for the first time yesterday. And that really pointed to sort of, this is the why, because nothing's really happened. I've been asked all week, why? Finally, the data we released yesterday sort of pointed to that.
Okay. Well, we have 30 seconds before we have to wrap up. What is the state right now? Is it going to be, if the election were held today, we still have 3 weeks, but if it were held today, is it a Conservative minority, majority, Liberal majority, minority? Who's holding the power here?
Yeah, it would be a conservative plurality of seats if an election were held today, about 37 to 30, with the NDP sitting around 18%. And that would translate to Conservatives having more seats than anybody else, and with the first chance at forming government.
Okay, so we'll have to keep an eye on this, but thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks again.
Joining me to help unpack some of these issues that are happening during the election and on the trail is Elliot Hughes, Senior Advisor with Summa Strategies and former advisor to Liberal Finance and Defense Ministers, and Yanni Macris, consultant with the Daisy Group and former Conservative staffer, federal and provincial. So thank you both for joining me today. Lots has happened. They're sort of start off as little things, but things blow up. It's an election. I feel like there's a microscope on any minor issue. And some of them maybe not so minor. So let's start with Maria Monsef's comment. So she's a Liberal Member of Parliament. She's Minister of Women and Gender Equality, Rural and Economic Development, and she's also an Afghan Canadian, which is lovely. However, she got herself in hot water this week because she referred to the Taliban during a Zoom discussion as brothers, referred to them as brothers, and a lot of Canadians seem to get very upset with this. Elliot, why don't you take the first shot at this? Was that just a gaffe? Are people really reading way too much into this? I mean, she's from Afghanistan originally. Maybe that was normal to say it in that way.
I don't think anyone should have the impression that because she used the word brothers when referring to the Taliban, that she in any way sympathizes with this terrorist organization. The Trudeau government and previous governments of sort of the Canadian government more broadly has designated the Taliban as a terrorist organization, as a terrorist government. I think it was a poor choice of words. She didn't necessarily have to use the word brother. It's a term that is used in the Muslim faith when referring to other people of the Muslim faith. I don't think there's other ways to talk about sort of other Muslims that you don't have to use the word brother. So I think it was just a poor choice of words. And unfortunately, just in the context of an election and what was going on in Afghanistan and, the soundbite world that we live in now, that sort of just got taken and spun out in a little bit of a misdirection and a misfire.
Yes, I got that sense as well. Of course, you're right. Temperatures are very high when we're seeing the images coming out of Afghanistan. But I think we have to remember that Minister Monsef herself left Afghanistan to come to Canada. So obviously she wasn't thrilled living there. There were circumstances that weren't ideal, and she sought out to live in Canada. Yanni, am I just glossing over this too much, or are Canadians really concerned with this, can I say, gaffe?
I think what the fact of the matter here is the fact that, like Elliot said, it was in fact a poor choice of words. But at the same time, how does that reflect to the Afghanis who are currently stranded in Afghanistan, who are facing persecution, who are facing, being potentially killed and imprisoned by the Taliban? How does that reflect to them? How does that reflect to the Afghani Canadians who came to Canada at the height of U.S. and Canadian presence in Afghanistan? How does it reflect to them? That's the question I pose. On one hand, it could be a gaffe. On another hand, it could be a political tactic, to strengthen a relationship with the Taliban, despite recognizing them as a terrorist organization. Is it Monsef trying to, get into their ear so they can finally listen? The Taliban won't. I think, like Elliot said, it was a poor choice of words. And quite frankly, I think it's disrespecting individuals who fled Afghanistan as a result of Taliban occupation.
Right. Okay. Well, that's an interesting perspective, and potentially it could have been some element of diplomacy happening there. That, as you mentioned, right? That's an actually interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about that. Let's shift gears. We're talking about rising temperatures, and yes, we're sweltering in heat in the last days of summer here in Canada. But it seems that there are more and more vocal protesters at various campaign events. And the video footage that I see coming off Twitter and social media, and sometimes even the news hour, tends to circle and surround Justin Trudeau's campaign appearances. And I have to say, some of the rhetoric being used and hurled towards the Prime Minister is shocking and very disrespectful for sure. And I don't know, I haven't seen anything like this. Maybe I haven't been around long enough, but I haven't seen anything like this before. Elliot, in the 40 seconds we have before commercial, we'll pick this up again, but what is the attribution? Why is this happening?
Well, people are angry. People are frustrated with COVID and what it's done. The lockdowns, which were necessary in order to beat the disease back. And it's understandable that they're upset. You have protests during elections all the time. People are very upset for various things. I think what you've seen here is a different level of animosity directed towards the Prime Minister mostly, but also to his staff and volunteers and RCMP detail. And it's because there's a very vociferous sort of feeling and reaction to the need to increase vaccination in this country and Trudeau's stance on that.
Welcome back to our election panel with Elliot Hughes and Yanni Macris. Elliot, before commercial, we were discussing the very heated protesters that seem to be following Justin Trudeau and his team. Why is that happening? You came up with some ideas as to what you think is causing this, or what's the impetus?
Yeah, as I was saying, I think it has something to do with the vaccine push that the Prime or Justin Trudeau has been behind and sort of encouraging Canadians to get on board with. That said, you do also need to remember that in 2019, Justin Trudeau had to wear a bulletproof vest to an event because there was a threat on his life at a campaign stop. I can't remember where it was. So in a way, this isn't actually that new. There has been a lot of antagonism towards Justin Trudeau for lots of reasons that would probably take its own show to unpack. But the fact of the matter is there is that anger directed towards him. And I think what you've seen is through these anti-vaccine protesters and other sort of protesters as well, is that they've now got the vaccination drive as, in a sense, a sort of funnel or as a vehicle to sort of get that anger out towards Trudeau.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, because I look at the other provincial elections that would have happened already. We think of Nova Scotia, British Columbia. I don't remember this level of vitriol, but perhaps it's timing that the vaccine mandates weren't sort of being proposed at that time, and this is kind of this intersection. But again, Yanni, you tell me. I was a political candidate. I remember receiving a lot of vitriol. It's scary. I had personal security at one point. It's not fun. It happens. You're right. It happens a lot. But just some of the vitriol that was coming, I was shocked. And maybe people are just really angry. Yanni?
I think it has to do with the misconception of how we do politics here in Canada. I think any threat towards any politician is disgusting. I think people who, regardless of their party, who put their name on a ballot, they're doing it because they intend to build a better Canada. And I think we just have different ways of doing it, whether you're a Liberal, Conservative, NDP, or Green Party. I think the root of it, though, is we try to emulate the United States a lot. I find here. You notice Aaron O'Toole's running a campaign very similar to that of Boris Johnson and elements of David Cameron's previous campaigns in the United Kingdom, trying to do politics differently in Canada. Whereas, you see individuals, in a world where we're so connected on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever platform of social media you use, you see them trying to emulate what happened in the U.S. You had the Capitol riots recently. You had, back during the Trump days, you had decapitation photos of Donald Trump circulating within the mainstream media. I think it's just the fact that, in Canada, we're not used to doing politics like that. Right. And because we try to emulate the United States so much, we're kind of having that trickle effect into our own political sphere.
Go ahead. Sorry, did you want to say something, Elliot?
I was just going to say, I do agree with some of those points. I do see some of the trend lines from the U.S. coming into Canada around, the protests and some of the thoughts and some of the slogans that you're hearing coming out of those protests. What I think is something different in Canada is I think there's a general acceptance among the major parties, and there's a need that they need to sort of push on this a little bit more, to sort of nip this in the bud and to make sure that they call it out when they see it, and not to let it fester and not to let it get attached to any one party or any one candidate or the way we do democracy in Canada. We've seen some of that. perhaps hasn't been as good from some party leaders, but certainly it's good to see the vast majority of Canadian politicians reacting to that in the right way.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a Conservative member of Parliament who basically issued a statement that because it was some of the volunteers were from his campaign. This is Kyle Seaback up in Ontario, and he found out that some of his campaign volunteers, I guess, went to this one protest where Justin Trudeau actually just canceled the event. I guess the threats were so serious, and he just said, "You know what? They're gone. They're not on my campaign." Which I thought, wow, that's pretty heavy-handed. But again, you know, at the same token, these are serious situations. Again, I remember being, I guess, in some ways, a victim of these kinds of things, and it's not pleasant. That's for sure. Yanni, was that the right move? We have 40 seconds to commercial, but was that enough?
You know what? What more can you do? What more can you do? You can't sit there and stop people from physically attending an event. It's their democratic right to attend any political party event. How they choose to conduct themselves at those events, I don't think is the responsibility of the individual that they may be supporting.
Right.
You know, I do think that the right move is to apologize and to, you know, outcast them from your association and affiliation. And I think what he did was the right thing. And really, what more can you do at that point?
Welcome back. We're wrapping up with an election panel. Joining me is Elliott Hughes, Senior Advisor with Summa Strategies and former advisor to Liberal Finance and Defence Ministers, and Yanni Makris, Consultant with the Daisy Group and former Conservative federal and provincial staffer. Just to wrap up what we were talking about before the break about these, you know, very vocal, very heated protesters coming around, and they seem to follow Justin Trudeau these days. You know, I do want to say that I do respect that people have to voice their opinions and have to voice their concern. And some people are very upset, maybe with the vaccine mandate. That seems to be one of the underlying causes here, or one of the issues. And so I'm happy that people are voicing their opinions, pro or con. You know, obviously there's a way to do that, or a more civilized way, I suppose, and maybe some of these individuals have gone too far. But I am glad that to see people, they are voicing their opinion, and if they can't do that within an election period, then when can they do it? Especially when we saw in the provincial of the province of Ontario, when we had protesters at Queen's Park, and you know the Premier dismissed them as yahoos. I remember that very clearly, and I thought, well, they have a right to their opinion. But I agree, there's a line, and we don't want to cross ever that line. It's a very firm line. So I just wanted to mention that. Let's shift gears for a second. Trudeau announced a housing policy, which I thought was quite good. He aims to ban blind bidding, which keeps buyers from seeing other people's offers. And this ban will crack down on predatory speculators so that you shouldn't lose a bidding war to speculators. And again, housing is a big issue this election. I've got to dedicate a whole episode to this. But I thought this was a good policy. Why don't you start, Elliott? What did you think?
Yeah, I'm a bit biased, but I did think this was a good policy. I think it was comprehensive. It was addressing what I think a lot of homeowners and home buyers, some of the frustrations they have with the home buying process getting really into the nitty gritty elements of it. And I think it speaks to a broader theme that the Liberals and Justin Trudeau are tapping into, or trying to tap into, which is this cost of living piece, which I think we are starting to see more and more of, housing being a very major part of that. You know, everywhere you go, anyone you talk to has either challenges buying a house or selling their houses for crazy amounts, but can't find a new place to move into. And the Liberals' housing strategy, on top of the housing strategy that they had already put through a few years ago, you know, seeks to address some of these ongoing challenges, because this is not going away. And this is something that the next government and the government after that and the government after that are going to have to deal with. I thought it was a good policy. I thought it was tackling some of the challenges that we see. Was it perfect? No, but I think it was a good start. And you know, it'll be interesting to see if that comes up in the debates coming up in the next couple of weeks.
Well, because the Conservatives also released some housing policy. And again, we're going to dedicate a whole episode to that on Counterpoint. But Yanni, to give you a chance to jump in here, did you think the policy went far enough? What do you think could have been better? How does it compare to the Conservative policy? You seem of that age that maybe you might be thinking about home ownership in the next few years. Does this help?
The number one issue facing Canadians, and specifically young Canadians, is affordability. Whether it would be with buying a house, with making any investments, whether it's your phone bill, something as simple as that. But what I find ironic is that the Liberal candidate for Vancouver Granville, was involved in at least 4 real estate deals where he was speculating, or at least it's alleged that he was speculating. I find it quite interesting that, I haven't certainly heard any comments from Justin Trudeau on this, nor have I heard anything other than, oh, I haven't engaged in speculative buying. And I find it interesting that the Liberal Party would put forward such a thing when they know a candidate actively engaged in that, and then won't comment on it. But then again, that's a whole other conversation. I think that the number one issue facing young people is affordability, and
right.
How can we make life more affordable for young Canadians? There was a report the other day that came out that Western Canada, in Calgary specifically, is one of the best markets for young people, millennials specifically, looking to purchase a home. Why can't we have that in Ontario? Why can't we have that in other parts of Canada? And I can tell you why. It's because of foreign buyers. You have foreign buyers coming into Vancouver, to Toronto, to the Niagara region where I am, and they're buying up properties. Yet it's inflating the market and preventing young people like myself and from other age groups from being able to purchase their homes. And you know what? Aaron O'Toole has a plan for that, and I think that plan is a step in the right direction. I don't think it handles the issue completely, but it's a good step.
Well, clearly housing is on every leader's minds, as we've now seen 2 of the major parties come out with robust housing plans, and we'll have to keep our eye on that. But thank you both for joining me. We're out of time, sadly.
Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you.